why chemotherapy or radiation has an impact on people's brain. And so I know the terminology chemo brain is pretty common because one of the first symptoms that happen is brain fog. But the reason being is regardless if you're just ingesting a pill or if you're doing localized radiation, it has a systemic effect, right? Mm-hmm. So we're doing it because we need to target those cancer cells and kill the cancer cells, but it's the same thing. It's going to have lasting effects on every cell in our body. Each cell is a little bit different. What we do know when it comes to a neuron cell is not only can it trigger the apoptosis changes, but a lot of times it affects our neurons exist with a chemical gradient, meaning there's a resting potential for a neuron that allows it to not fire. Now, if we change that gradient and we get that neuron closer to action potential, that means it takes anything to come in and it fires. So it's electrical chemical signaling. What happens is we get a lot of this excitotoxicity when you're exposed to chemotherapy or radiation, and those cells end up dying off. Now, the cells that are more likely to be impacted when it comes to the brain is going to be the cells that are most metabolically active, and we have some commonalities in the brain. So we know that the cerebellum and the vestibular system is very active, okay, metabolically active, and then we know that midbrain area is also really active, the basal ganglia and stuff like that. So they typically have a higher probability of being impacted. Once one area of the brain gets impacted and the neurons are kind of getting destroyed and they're dying off, those neurons are sending signals and connections throughout the whole entire brain. So you get all these secondary and tertiary downstream changes because if a neuron is not activated, eventually without activation it dies, right? So you end up having these other changes like the frontal lobe and parietal lobe that end up being an issue. The specific symptoms you have are generally going to reflect what your baseline brain function was prior to chemotherapy and radiation. So with your mom, you know that she was previously having some anxiety or panic while she was driving. So we already know there was that otolithic vestibular imbalance baseline, right? So then she's exposed to the chemotherapy, and so since that area was already a weak area, it just gets way worse. And that's the expression of what's happening today.